I would like to convince people that I'm an atheist, but the truth I like to hide is that I am actually agnostic. I say this not as the result of some statement of faith, but because I have seen things that do not fall in line with my otherwise rational view of the world. One such example comes from my freshman year of college. I had been infatuated with a young woman by the name of Camille. She was an odd one. She was a Wiccan. I didn't really mind her religion so much as I found it to be a little bit different from what I was used to. She wore a pentacle pendant on her necklace and wore dark clothing most places she went, hair dyed black, painted black nails. It seemed reminiscent of the goth kids I ran into in high school. Anyway, Camille had invited me to join her friends Sean and Colby on a ghost hunt. I don't believe in ghosts. I didn't then, and I still don't. Even still, I was barely 20, and it was an excuse to wander around a cemetery with a cute girl at night. When the time came to load into her Camry and head to the graveyard, I sat up front with her. Sean and Colby had convinced another girl by the name of Sam to join us. Sam would spout out trivia knowledge and facts about the cemetery, while Camille would talk about how she got a weird vibe from the place. I mostly kept quiet. I didn't want my cynicism to ruin the chance of hooking up with the hot goth girl. Fairview Cemetery was our destination. It was an old Civil War cemetery that was still in use by the city. In fact, Bowling Green had been the Confederate state capital during the short time that Kentucky had seceded from the Union. It was a rather large cemetery. The main gate closes at dusk, but Camille used a service road to get us into an older part of the cemetery. We got out of the car and walked around. Camille would clasp her pendant in her hands and mutter under her breath as she walked between the rows of graves. Sean and Colby seemed to be playing some sort of tag as they ran over the graves. Sam cautiously walked behind me as I followed Camille. It was obvious that she was kind of bothered by the quiet darkness. We eventually made our way to the rear of the cemetery. I found a bench sitting on a marble platform. It seemed to be a shrine to some Catholic saint, though I cannot remember which one. It was either a shrine or an elaborate headstone, but it was a bench and my feet were sore, so I sat down. Directly in front of me and about 50 feet away stood a massive tree. The trunk was nearly as wide as the car, and it stood so tall I couldn't see the top of it in the darkness. Under the boughs of this tree sat several rows of headstones that were smaller than the ones we had seen in other parts of the cemetery. Camille began shouting at Sean and Colby because they were both urinating on the same headstone. I ran up to check on the commotion and saw the epitaph on the gravestone. He was a good Negro. We were in the slave cemetery, and it had become painfully obvious that Sean and Colby were racists. Be it coincidence or perhaps by some chance the universe showing a sense of irony for once, a strong wind came out of nowhere and shook the massive tree we stood under. A rather large stick fell from the branches and hit Colby on the shoulder hard enough to take him to the ground. I laughed as he fell into his own urine, and Camille smirked as she said something to the effect of respecting the spirits. Sean and Colby weren't hearing it. They began shouting and hollering as they kicked over gravestones. They dared anything that might go bump in night to come out and play. I really wish they hadn't. The wind picked up again, this time bringing with it a shift in the clouds that allowed the moon to show enough light to illuminate the ground around us, so that it almost seemed near morning, even though it was barely past midnight. It was at this point that I noticed that I hadn't seen Sam in a while. In fact, I had been so distracted by the two racist vandals that I hadn't noticed that Camille was gone too. I did a quick turnabout and caught sight of both of them huddling together on the marble bench over by the shrine to Saint whatever of wherever. Their faces were locked in state of terror. The hair stood up on the back of my neck, and I saw what stood about halfway between us. A small, black child. She wore tattered clothes. Her skin was emaciated like those poor Ethiopians you see in those depressing commercials. The way the moonlight shone against her gave her an eerie glow. I went to shine my flashlight on her, and she was gone. But no sooner than I moved the beam away, I saw her as if she hadn't moved. I wasn't afraid so much as I was curious. I walked forward and leaned down. "What's your name, little girl?" I said as I tried to get her attention. No sooner than I tried to place my hand on her shoulder, she darted off behind a gravestone, and she was gone. The girls were still looking my way in fear. It was only then that I realized that they were staring past me. At nearly every overturned gravestone there stood an individual dressed in tattered rags, with empty looks on their faces. As with the little girl, when I swept the light from my flashlight towards them, they disappeared and reappeared when the artificial light touched them. They did not seem to be facing me or the girls for that matter. Their empty stares seemed fixated on Sean and Colby, who continued knocking over gravestones and shouting racial slurs as they moved through them, oblivious to their presence. A feeling of dread came over me, and admittedly, I ran to the girls. An emaciated figure that seemed a bit more decayed than the rest emerged from the crowd. He must have stood 7 foot tall. He stood wider than a doorframe. Even in his advanced state of decay, you could tell this was a large man in life. He moved towards Sean and Colby with a slow determination, only to stop directly in front of them. As they went to kick over another gravestone, the tall figure planted his massive foot against it. It wouldn't budge. The other headstones were so old and loose that they would just give with just a slight push. Sean wouldn't be denied. He jumped and planted both feet against it. Nothing happened. Finally, he got a running start and jumped. He planted both feet against the headstone, and it too crashed against the ground, shattering in the process. The tall man and all the other figures were already gone as Sean crashed onto the ground and landed face first onto another felled headstone. The sound that it made was like someone hitting a coconut with a baseball bat. I don't know what Colby saw. By this point, I was rushing over to Sean to check on his injury. All I know for sure is that he let out a whimpering shout before backing up and falling backwards onto a headstone, and the back of his head smacked against the stone. Camille was already on her cell phone calling an ambulance, and I stood on the marble slab with Sam and Camille as the EMTs loaded Sean and Colby onto separate gurneys and carted them to the hospital. After giving our statements to the police and being given a lecture on trespassing, we made our way back to the car. The car ride back to the dorms was silent. I never saw Sam again, and Camille was reluctant to talk about what happened. Sean and Colby lived, but both had severe concussions. Sean had a skull fracture. To this day, I question what actually happened, and what details of that night have been obscured by the nightmares I've had since. One other thing. By all outward appearances, I look white, but my grandmother was biracial. Her father, my great-grandfather, had an uncommon last name. The gravestone next to the little girl had the same last name. My family has lived in Kentucky since the Civil War, and my great-great-grandfather was a slave, whose first child was a daughter who died young in Bowling Green, Kentucky.